sir. Seta gote tax hisabe neichu sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Sir, thank you sir.
No. Hello, Vikrant. Anand Dada has also joined. Vikrant, you are giving vote of thanks today. Eli, we spoke in our mother tongue in between, so don't mind.
No.
Most of us belong to a state called Odisha. So Professor Pradhan, myself, and some of his students, we belong to Odisha in India.
Which is next to Mumbai.
We spoke in Odia. So that is.
It is in Eastern India.
Eastern India.
Okay.
So when after the pandemic, so if you come, then you will see.
It is near Calcutta.
Okay. And that is where you're located, or
Calcutta is the nearest city that way. Bhubaneswar is our capital. Eastern Odisha. Bhubaneswar would be our capital, but the nearest metro city and the old in the old India, Calcutta is the nearest city. So
the first capital of the British India. That was the first capital.
Yes, sir. Yes.
But we, Professor Panda, are in Mumbai, right?
Yeah. We are at. I'm at present affiliated to Mumbai Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. Abhishek is a research scholar working with me at present.
Hello, sir.
And Vikrant is also a student. So initially, as I mentioned to you, we started doing lectures here in the every week we used to meet. But during this pandemic, we got an opportunity to invite people and through this web facility. That was better.
Well, at least
Yeah.
one
Then,
advantage of the
yeah, it was an
pandemic,
advantage that way. Yes. Then Professor Pradhan is actually our teacher who taught us Wittgenstein during our student days. We studied like Muhammad Ali, who joined. He was one of the participant last lecture. So Muhammad Ali, myself, we were all taught by Professor Pradhan when we were student in University of Hyderabad. So that is where Professor Pradhan is a professor. So he lives in Hyderabad. Yes. Currently, he lives in Hyderabad after his retirement. So Professor Jhadeswar Ghosh is from one of the universities in West Bengal. So
I visited
very long time ago, the Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Nehru University.
Delhi.
Vikrant studied his master MA from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Yeah. Ali Ashok, welcome.
Namaskar, bhai, namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Dr. Friedlander. I enjoyed your question last time.
I look forward to
discussions today.
Yes.
We will wait for 2-3 minutes more and then.
has the school year started in Mumbai, or still
No,
the summer vacation?
no, this is our mid-semester examination time.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
everything is online, and the exam has started. So
Right.
I have my own examination, and on 14th. On 14th, I will have examination. Yeah. Usually Saturdays are non-working days, in the sense that we don't have classes on Saturday. We can take examination and do other activities, but no class on Saturdays. So Saturdays that way is an off day for IIT Bombay.
Good afternoon,
Hello,
sir. Good
Varadha.
afternoon,
Good
everyone.
afternoon. Good afternoon. Varadha Lakshmi teaches in Presidency University, Calcutta. Yeah. Ashok is also Ashok Tarai is also teaching in university, Gangadhar Meher University in Odisha. Um, so, so
Uh,
his
uh,
work is also on Tractatus. He did PhD
yeah,
with.
I did my yeah with Professor Pradhan.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm also very much interested in Wittgenstein's work. Yeah. So looking forward to your talk, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we can start now. Abhishek.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So
Well,
I yes,
just
yes, sir. Sure.
good afternoon, everyone. Um, we are having the second lecture under this centenary lecture series of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Today, lecture will be delivered by Professor Eli Friedlander, and the session will be chaired by Professor Arsi Pradhan. And I welcome you all to this lecture. And now I request Professor Abhishek Yadav to introduce Professor Friedlander.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of Forum of Philosophy in this second lecture of the Centenary lecture series on Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And I also welcome the speaker for today's session, Professor Eli Friedlander. Professor Friedlander is a professor of modern philosophy at Tel Aviv University, Israel, and his areas of specialization includes 20th century analytic and continental philosophy, philosophy of history, aesthetics, and Kant. And Professor Friedlander has published numerous articles and has authored a number of books. And we have this wonderful opportunity today to listen to his insights. The title of today's talk is The World is My World, Wittgenstein's Tractatus and Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation.
Vikrant, record karo na.
Professor Friedlander, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Panda, for the invitation. I look forward to the discussion following the paper. I will read the paper. It's actually forthcoming in a volume edited by another one of the speakers you will have in this series by Gilad Lear. And I will take around 50 minutes, and then we'll be happy for your comments and questions and the discussion that follows. Let me just say that I do rely in some places on materials, on earlier work of mine on the Tractatus, some in my book, Signs of Sense, but mostly two more recent papers. One entitled Missing a Step Up the Ladder, and another one called Logic, Ethics, and Existence in Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and I'll be happy to make them.
Sorry to interrupt. Sometimes it is not audible.
Okay.
Sometimes it is audible. Sometimes it is not audible.
Let's see. Is this a problem that everyone has?
Yeah. Now it is clear, much clearer. But earlier it was little slower. Voice was little slow.
I think, Professor, there is something with the positioning of your ear pod because at some angles the voice is clearer and at some angles it's not.
I see. So maybe it's better that I
Yeah, you will have to unmute yourself. I think you removed the device, so now you're on mute. Yes.
Okay. Is this better now?
Yeah, this is better. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. So my talk attempts to reevaluate the pertinence of Schopenhauer's philosophy to Wittgenstein's early work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It is well known that as a young man, Wittgenstein was taken by Schopenhauer's work. Some commentators have noted similarities between moments in Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation and propositions of the Tractatus as well as the notebooks. Yet, the difficulty is always whether and how to incorporate these similarities into a unified reading of the Tractatus. And I think it might very well be the case that in order to recognize the role of Schopenhauer's thought in the Tractatus, it will be necessary to reorient our reading of that book. Now, as its title suggests, Schopenhauer's central work sets up a fundamental distinction of aspects of the world. We can conceive of the world as representation and of the world as will. Or, as Schopenhauer puts it in the first section of Book 1, the world is my representation and the world is my will. The fundamental form of representation, that is, of phenomena, is the principle of sufficient reason. In one of its formulations, it reads, "Nothing is without a reason for being so rather than not." The principle of sufficient reason establishes all knowledge as having a conditional form. It is always referred to a prior condition. And this condition, according to Schopenhauer, has a fourfold character. It can be a cause, a premise of a deduction, an intuitive ground, or the motivation for an action. While not wanting here to elaborate further these four different domains of representation, I wish nevertheless to explore briefly how they can be seen to depend on a higher standpoint, the presence, as it were, of the will in phenomena,
which, as opposed to the why or how of giving reason, will be tentatively called the what, the essence, or the idea. Theoretical explanation answering the why question is always conditional. More importantly, that which is to be explained and the explanation are always of the same kind. To take the example of a causal explanation, if we adduce the cause for a certain event, that cause itself will have a further cause, and so on ad infinitum. The principle of sufficient reason does not reach an ultimate ground, another order than the appearance to be explained. That latter dimension, which Schopenhauer characterized through the question, what, is the presentation of the inner meaning, essence, or substance of the world, in relation to which the answer to the why is revealed as unsatisfactory, as not really explaining. And I share a PowerPoint with mainly the quotations I will read. So this is the first quote. No science in the proper sense of the term, I mean systematic cognition guided by the principle of sufficient reason, will ever reach its final goal or be able to achieve a fully satisfactory explanation. This is because science has nothing to do with the inner essence of the world and can never go beyond representation. In fact, it really teaches us nothing more than to recognize the relation of one representation to another. So the question what, I would say, points to the self-expression, or as Schopenhauer calls it, the complete objectification of the will in representation. This is what Schopenhauer identifies as the idea and refers his use of the term to Plato rather than to Kant. Ideas form a hierarchy or can be conceived as degrees of objectification of the will. Each degree is defined by the way it takes in and transforms within itself lower degrees of objectification. So as to elaborate how the idea relates to what we think of as laws of nature, Schopenhauer raises a strange question. He asks us, why is it that laws of nature hold in every place, in space, and at every time? Why is it that always and everywhere, when these conditions are present, then that other thing happens? As long as we think here in terms of external relations between different states or real processes happening in space and time, we are at a loss to satisfactorily address the matter. We are led to wonder why nature never forgets its laws, or why doesn't it get tired, right? This, as Wittgenstein might probably think of it, is a bout of nonsense, a sign that questioning really is out of place. The surprise disappears, according to Schopenhauer, as soon as we recognize that what is at issue is not a relation of different events that always and everywhere follow the same law, but rather a unity of being. Something being just what it is raises no question, nor does it require any explanation. But it is exactly what is at issue when we recognize the dependence of laws of phenomena on ideas, right? The idea is a unity of being apart from the extension of space and time. The multitude of particular occurrences falling under a law of nature, which everywhere and always is the same, are just the refractions in space and time of that oneness of being. And I quote again, our astonishment over the law-like and precise operations of the forces of nature, over the perfect uniformity of all their millions of appearances, over the infallibility of their emergence can be compared to the astonishment of a child or a savage who sees a flower through a many-faceted glass for the first time and wonders over the perfect uniformity of the countless flowers that he sees, counting the leaves of each one separately. End of quote. So the mirror of this kaleidoscope are space and time. And the idea is as it were refracted in them whenever and wherever there is an occasion for its manifestation, thereby forming a perfect pattern and giving the appearance of this orderly and lawful character. As we turn to Wittgenstein now, we find his account of the principle of sufficient reason and the lawfulness of nature towards the end of the Tractatus, almost as an afterthought to the work on logic. These propositions will not be my focus, but let me try to draw a very general parallel to Schopenhauer. Wittgenstein challenges our sense that overarching principles of lawfulness in nature are contentful. Right? He writes, all such propositions, including the principle of sufficient reason, the laws of continuity in nature and of least effort in nature, etc., all these are a priori insights about the forms in which the propositions of science can be cast. And he adds, laws like the principle of sufficient reason, etc., are about the net and not about what the net describes. Specifically, a principle of causality as such, right? The first form, according to Schopenhauer, of the principle of sufficient reason is not a contentful principle about the behavior of objects. Wittgenstein writes, if there were a law of causality, it might be put in the following way. There are laws of nature. But of course, that cannot be said. It makes itself manifest. One could also say that Wittgenstein casts doubt on the explanatory force of the lawfulness of nature. As he puts it, the whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. Not that we are to seek other kinds of explanations, rather we are to present phenomena as an order apart from the explanation adduced by the principle of sufficient reason. An initial parallel in the Tractatus to Schopenhauer's account of the relation of phenomena to the order of ideas can be found, I want to argue, in the construal of the relation between facts, state of affairs, and objects. While Wittgenstein does not oppose why and what, as Schopenhauer does, we saw, he still works with a similar opposition between the how and the what. This discussion recurs at different levels. It is the distinction between the structure of facts and the forms of objects in states of affairs, between the structure of representation and the form of a picture, where he writes, form is the possibility of structure. It also occurs explicitly when Wittgenstein discusses names of objects and the fact represented by propositions. For propositions, he writes, can only say how things are, not what they are. So objects are substance, the what, to be recognized, whereas facts are the how, presupposing the what. To properly think of these together, we must avoid conceiving of objects merely as particulars falling under various concepts and behaving according to various general laws. Objects are first and foremost identified by their form. Space, time, and color, to take Wittgenstein's examples, are object forms, which allows certain configurations of colored surfaces, say in space and time. The object in itself is form, and Wittgenstein has a nice way to put it. He says, in a manner of speaking, objects are colorless, right? They are just form. Facts would be specific structures made possible by the object forms. In that sense, I would say we do not start with facts and consider objects that are, as it were, contained in them as constituents, but rather the form of object is logically prior and determines within itself the space of possibilities. Similarly, in picturing, we construct a situation or a structure relating representatives of object within an object form, right? The form of the picture, and this is extremely important, is identical to the form of the objects whose arrangement we depict. But the structure pictured might or might not agree to the structure of facts. Let me give an example. Okay, suppose I wish to represent a situation in which John is seated behind Jack and Jack is seated behind Jim. What would this demand, right, to construct a picture in Wittgenstein terms? So in a pictorial place, first of all, I'll have to have three representatives for each person. So X is the representative of John, Y is the representative of Jack, and Z is the representative of Jim. I use the term representative, this is Wittgenstein's term, and this is very different from relations of meaning, of Bedeutung. So it's just some kind of arbitrary correlation which makes X stand for an object or a person in this case. Now, I form in the picture a certain structure, right, in which X, Y, and Z are related in a certain way, right? Here it is X is behind Y and Y is behind Z. But this is not all that goes into picturing. The important point is that I further need to have, as I said, an identity of form, not structure, form of the picture and of the reality depicted. And in this case, the identical form just is two-dimensional space, right? Just as in order to put in reality those people one behind the other, we need that two-dimensional space, and the picture itself is two-dimensional. And it's only because of that identity, the same object form, that we can say that one is picturing the other. Okay, and of course, once we have this identity of form, we can also have pictures that are false, but are still about that reality, right? Here we have a false picture, pictures where the structure depicted does not agree with the structure in reality, but still the form is identical. In both cases, it's two-dimensional. That's the condition for having this here picture, even falsely, that reality. Okay, so I would say the object, okay, one word about the role played by logical constants in this scheme. So importantly, the logical constants and the quantifiers are not representatives of objects. They are operations allowing us to construct an arrangement of representatives in the object forms. So operations are, according to this view to be distinguished strictly from concepts or relations, which are part of the contentful structure of situations of that form. So in our example, the concept or the relation is behind, to be behind. The application of operations on a structure would yield another structure in the same object form. Therefore, one way of presenting an object form is by way, Wittgenstein tells us, of a term and an operation whose repeated application generates or opens up the whole space of form. Okay, sorry for this bit of quasi-technical considerations, but I think they are important to see the similarity I tried to form here between Wittgenstein and Schopenhauer. So let me sum it up in this following way. Real possibilities presuppose substance, presuppose the object form. The object form is really the source of all contents. And the possible structures, now I speak in Schopenhauer's language, would just be refractions of the object form in logical space, right? Refractions, Schopenhauer would say, of ideas. And with respect to forms, no question can be raised and no explanation given, right? We can't ask how many forms there are, or why does this form fit with that one, right? Why do space and time fit together? Those are pseudo questions. The principle of sufficient reason, I would say, has no place with regard to object forms. There is no reason why they are so and not otherwise. Okay? Now, particular objects fall under concepts, but as we saw, the will objectifies itself in ideas. One of the terms through which Schopenhauer characterizes the objectification of the will in ideas is the term mirroring. And it's interesting that it's also a term that appears in the Tractatus to express precisely the distinction between what is represented in propositions, what is said, and the presentation of the form. Right? Propositions cannot represent logical form. It is mirrored in them. What finds reflection in language, language cannot represent. What expresses itself in language, we cannot express by means of language. Propositions show the logical form of reality, they display it. This notion of mirroring in Wittgenstein is also extended, I would say, to the manifestation of the inner unity of a whole space of meaning. Right? For example, in the following quote in 5.51, he writes, "How can logic, all-embracing logic, which mirrors the world, use such peculiar crotchets and contrivances? Only because they are all connected with one another, infinitely fine network, the great mirror." I don't know how much you're. We might nevertheless wonder whether it is possible to bring together Schopenhauer's claims that ideas mirror the will with Wittgenstein's account of mirroring form in language. So what is it about Wittgenstein that allows us to read some idea of will, some vital, I would say, dimension of language, which is mirrored in the forms that we recognize in language? The will, remember, is the inner life of what appears. And so I ask, is there similarly a life life that is internal to the revelation of form in the Tractatus. Reduced a priori once and for all, but rather they must be recognized, right, as the self-unfolding or revelation of this dimension of life in everyday language. To develop in more details this parallel with Schopenhauer, we need now to dwell a bit further on the manifestation of the world as will. So I returned for a while to Schopenhauer and then back to Wittgenstein. Now, while the expression, the world is my representation, is something we might be familiar with in the philosophical tradition, or at least have different idealist models to identify it with, the expression, the world is my will, has a completely different character. Here, Schopenhauer speaks of a truth that must be very serious and alarming, if not terrifying to anyone. A truth that can and must be maintained as well, namely, the world is my will. In this second part of my talk, I want to ask how we can relate this duality, the world is my representation and the world is my will, to the single moment in Wittgenstein, which he expresses as the world is my world. In particular, the challenge would be to conceive of this last expression, which he also formulates as I am my world, not just in terms of the register of representation, but also of what Schopenhauer would call the world as will. In Schopenhauer, access to the world as will is opened up initially by way of my own body. That immediate sense of the will is to be distinguished from the consideration of the form of particular willing, that is, such willing that falls under the principle of sufficient reason of motivation, a will mediated by the representation of a purpose. Schopenhauer resists the picture of will as a causality from concepts. By focusing on the body, he singles a dimension that cannot be so explained. While purpose belongs to willing some state of affairs in the world, it is in no way the efficient cause of the action of the body. There is no act of will, say in thought, that then must connect somehow to the body so as to put it in action. There's no act of will separate from the action of the body. My willing and my acting are one. In that sense, what we might call willing to do something in the future still belongs to deliberation. It's not an act of will, right? Willing and doing, Schopenhauer writes, are different only for reflection. In actuality, they are one. Every true, genuine, and immediate act of will is instantly and immediately also the appearance of an act of the body. Similarly, affections such as pleasure and pain give us immediate access to the presence of the will in my body. right? Pleasure and pain are not representations. When bumping my toe against the leg of the table, I do not attribute the sensation of pain to the table as I might attribute hardness to it. Nor is pain merely represented as a property of an object, which is my body. For then I would be able to ask myself whether or not this is my pain. No, pain immediately involves, it is immediately my own, or rather, since it is in and of itself involving, it would sound strange precisely to say that it is mine, as I could say of an umbrella when someone else is about to take it. Now, between the willing and the action, there seemed to be a condition, namely the form of my body, right? I act in ways that my body makes possible. Therefore, if the immediate identity of will and action is to be maintained, the form of the body itself must belong to the expression of the metaphysical will. We are to think of the body as objectified will and conceive of the actualization of its capacities in action as what can allow further expression of that will. Moreover, the involvement of representation in the actualization of these capacities is secondary, wholly dependent on the prior ground of the form of bodily capacities. Right? The possibility of action of a lion are different than those of a snake. Each is determined by the form of its body, right? The form that in each just is, according to Schopenhauer, the objectification of the will. But a further difficulty appears as we try to give sense to what Schopenhauer thinks of as the world as will. Indeed, if we start from something like a sense of the will as what inherently and immediately involves me, and suppose we even extend this to my relation to my own body, then how are we to account for the metaphysical will manifesting itself in other beings as well? Put differently, there will be a tension in Schopenhauer's account of the access to the world as will. Indeed, representation can be said to cover all facts extensively. I can represent to myself everything that can be the case. Representation is extensionally universal. But especially beginning with my sense of pleasure and pain, it would appear that what is truly will for me ends, so to speak, at the periphery of my body. And sometimes Schopenhauer speaks as though I have to extend by analogy this aspect to things other than my own body, that is, to other beings in the world. But analogy is representation, of course, and thus would not allow me to partake immediately in the world as will. So the question is it possible, and what would it be like to experience the world from inside? Not via the analogies that representation gives us of it. There's one moment in the opening of the second book of The World as Will and Representation that suggests extending what is immediately involving to the world as such. After the discussion of Book 1, devoted to the different forms of the principle of sufficient reason, Schopenhauer sees himself as having established the possibility of knowledge of phenomena. And yet, such a world, he says, would still be lacking in significance. And I read, we will particularly be interested in discovering the true meaning of intuitive representations. We have only ever felt this meaning before, But this has ensured that the images do not pass by us strange and meaningless, as they would otherwise necessarily have done. Rather, they speak and are immediately understood and have interest that engages our entire being. Right? I would perhaps translate here the German term Bedeutung in this context as significance rather than meaning. Right? Schopenhauer has a notion of meaning or sense developed in his account of language as part of the realm of representation. Yet, as we see from this quote, the mere representation of sense leaves phenomena external to us. Right? They remain foreign. They do not speak to us. Right? And in reality, phenomena are involving. Things are significant to us, not because we project on them various purposes or intentions we have. It is as manifestations of the world as will, that they speak to us and open up the very possibility to have subjective purposes. Okay, so now I want to take this discussion and try to see whether we can find something parallel to it in the Tractatus. And here I will rely quite a lot on Wittgenstein's notebooks. There are some immediate similarities between Schopenhauer's discussion and moments in Wittgenstein's notebooks. Wittgenstein, just like Schopenhauer, insists that there is no separate act of will which causes the action of the body. And he further dismisses, just as Schopenhauer does, the notion that I can will now to act in the future. There is no independent act of will separate from the acting. Right? I read from the notebook, this is clear. It is impossible to will without already performing the act of will. The act of will is not the cause of the action, but is the action itself. And again, the fact that I will an action consists in my performing the action, not in my doing something else which causes the action. Right? When I move something, I move. When I perform an action, I am in action. As we saw for Schopenhauer, the metaphysical will expresses itself in the form of my body. And each creature's body is to be conceived similarly as the immediate expression of that will. This raised for us the question whether what appears to be the privileged and immediate sense of my body as I partake in the expression of the will can extend to an internal recognition of the expression of the will in other bodies. For we might be tempted to say, even though I sense my own body immediately, I can only infer as to the expression of the will in the body of another creature. This question of the psychophysical parallelism is broached in the notebook, I would say importantly, with a remark concerning significance. And I quote again from the notebooks, things acquire significance only through their relation to my will. One might be tempted again to interpret this as a matter of representation for the particular will. Something will be significant for me if I can in some way represent it to myself as pertaining to the satisfaction of my desires, right? This apple, say, is not neutral to me since eating it will alleviate my hunger. And that's why it's significant. But this is not what Wittgenstein is after here. I don't, as it were, project value onto things because I desire them. Right? Wittgenstein writes, for everything is what it is and not another thing. In other words, we should not think of significance as making something more than it is, as though coloring it with some subjective purposes. Significance belongs to the internal character of a thing when recognized in and of itself, right? The question is precisely how to understand properly this in itself, this view from within, as it were. Right? Recall that for Schopenhauer, it is the will precisely that is the in itself, in the Kantian sense, of the world as representation. Can we similarly argue that when Wittgenstein takes significance that relates to my will, uh, when Wittgenstein, sorry, I mean, that when he speaks of this connection between significance and my will, he's also speaking of something like world will. Okay, Wittgenstein begins by laying out in these remarks a common way of thinking of the psychophysical parallelism. And he writes, one conception, as I can infer my spirit, character, or will from my physiognomy, so I can infer the spirit, will of each thing from its physiognomy. Now, this is not some fancy sense of the spiritual, but rather really spirit that can be revealed in bodily comportment or in physiognomy. And physiognomy is not restricted to human feature or expressions. It is really the form of the body insofar as it makes present the character of a being, the will, as it were, internal to a being. And Wittgenstein mentions indeed later the spirit of the wasp, that of the elephant, that of the lion. So don't take spirit here too spiritually, as it were. As the parentheses indicate, will is taken here as being of the same order as spirit and character, rather than, of course, referring to an individual act of will, right? We're talking about the will that manifests itself in the form of a being, in the physiognomy of a being. But can I infer my spirit from my physiognomy, Wittgenstein asks? Since he underlines here infer, I assume the point is not whether I have enough grounds, say, to infer my spirit from my physiognomy, but rather whether it is an inference at all. Of course, if we answer in the negative, this might lead to the opposite hypothesis, which is the next thing that Wittgenstein writes. Isn't this relationship then purely empirical? Does my body really express anything? Is it itself an internal expression of something? Is, for example, an angry face angry in itself, or merely because it is empirically connected with bad temper? Now, Wittgenstein dismisses the empirical, causal, or external explanation of expression as well. For, as he puts it in the next sentence, it is clear that the causal nexus is not a nexus at all. So expression is not inference, nor is it reducible to an empirical external relation. I would say, again, in the Schopenhauerian spirit, the body is the immediate internal expression of spirit or will. Okay, so even assuming that this something like that is, my interpretation is right, we are still left to get from the inner connection of character and expression in my case to recognizing it in other beings. Wittgenstein writes, now it is true, following the psychophysical conception, that my character is expressed, is it true that my character is expressed only in the build of my body or brain and not equally in the build of the whole of the rest of the world? Right? And he adds, this contains a salient point. Right? I would say much turns on how we understand what is salient here, right? the temptation would be once more to appeal to some kind of projection. For how otherwise could the rest of the world be an expression of my character? Yet, I think there is another way to go. What is primary is the expression of spirit or will in the world. That is its significant character, the significant character of the world. It is by partaking in the expression of spirit in the world that I can recognize my own spirit. And conversely, my own access to spirit is inextricable from the recognition of spirit in the world. Right? Neither is spirit recognized, as it were, from the outside, nor can it only be recognized in me. If I express my own spirit, then I must be able to recognize it in the rest of the world. Right? As Wittgenstein sums it up, this parallelism then really exists between my spirit, i.e., spirit, and the world. I sense spirit in myself, yet it is not just my spirit. Right? Wittgenstein writes again, only remember that the spirit of the snake, of the lion, is your spirit, for it is only from yourself that you are acquainted with spirit at all. Spirit, I would say, is one and the same in me and in the snake and the lion. It is from myself that I am acquainted with spirit at all. Again, it would be tempting to fall back on the explanation that I have given, as it were, projected spirit onto the physiognomy of another being by way of analogy with what is truly my own. But there's no two-step process here in which I infer from the recognition of my own case to the spirit or will dimension of the snake. My body, is on the same level with that of the wasp and of the snake, so that I have neither inferred from that of the wasp to mine, nor from mine to that of the wasp. I partake in spirit as such, and thereby it is the world that is my own. And I quote a really important passage, again, for the comparison to Schopenhauer, that ends this discussion in the notebooks. Is this the solution of the puzzle why men have always believed that there was one spirit common to the whole world? And in that case, it would, of course, also be common to lifeless things too. And in this sense, I can also speak of a will that is common to the whole world. But this will is, in a higher sense, my will, as my idea is the world in the same way that my will is the world will. One cannot get closer, I think, in Wittgenstein to an expression of Schopenhauer's fundamental thought. But you might say, okay, this is the notebooks, and it's different in the Tractatus. So I want now to suggest precisely how this dimension of significance or involvement internal to meaning as such is central also to Wittgenstein's progress in the Tractatus. This is tantamount to asking about the methodical role that the locution my plays in that book. Not surprisingly, it comes up in finding a place for the subject, right? And this is at the same time as Wittgenstein systematically introduces the notion of world as well as a new concept of limit. We mostly append my to, let's say, a variety of particulars: my car, my house, my dog, my friend, and so on. But in the Tractatus, the locution my appears in conjunction with seemingly impersonal expressions such as world or language. Right? Thus, in 5.6, Wittgenstein writes, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Wouldn't it be more in line with the consideration of facts, objects, and proposition to just write the limits of language mean the limits of the world? The addition of my, as I've tried to argue, is not merely stylistic, but precisely shows that a new dimension of meaning as such is opened up in the propositions that follow. To put it somewhat schematically, facts have a structure and their representation is the sense of a proposition. Objects have form that can be shown, and they are the meaning, Bedeutung of names. The world exists and involves the subject in being significant, that is, being what is my own. Wittgenstein's short discussion of solipsism precisely illuminates how this my own is manifest in language and what justified speaking of, I quote, that language which alone I understand. Of course, without making this a private language. Solipsism is often interpreted as an idealist moment through the register of representation, as the claim that the world is my representation. The solipsism of representation would lead all appearance back to a center that is supposedly the locus of the subject. But Wittgenstein wishes to recognize the truth in solipsism, and that, to put it in Schopenhauerian terminology, is to recognize that the world is my will. Strictly speaking, there is no my own without the dimension of world will. Right? The world is my will means, as we saw, that I'm partaking in world will. That is, I can recognize significance in things. The metaphysical subject is not the subject of representation, but rather the subject of will. Or more precisely, it could be the subject of significance, expressed simply as the world is my world. Right? This is, as it were, the most succinct expression of what I take to be this Schopenhauerian insight in Wittgenstein. It is this intuition concerning the truth of solipsism that is reflected in the famous proposition on the world as I found it. And I read, there's no such thing as the subject that thinks or entertains ideas. If I wrote a book called The World as I Found It, it should have to include a report on my body and should have to say which parts were subordinate to my will and which were not, etc. It's being a method of isolating the subject, or rather of showing that in an important sense, there is no subject, for it alone could not be mentioned in the book. Recall that for Schopenhauer, without the standpoint of the world as will, there would be a fundamental lack in our involvement in the world. It would not wear a face of significance for us. Indeed, from the pure standpoint of representation, even my body is as neutral to me as the stone I see. I would not be able to find myself in the world. Right? It would be as though the world would pass as images that are strange and meaningless. So finding myself is tantamount to being in a world of significance. Indeed, to speak of the subject as a limit of the world means that it is manifest in a new inflection of the space of meaning as a whole, of the world as a whole. The subject is not in the world, its manifestation is correlative with the world as a whole, wearing a face of familiarity. Now, I see that my time is pretty much up. I had another section which brings together Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein on ethics, but I don't know. Maybe we can just leave that to the question period so that I don't talk too much. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you briefly say something about that section?
Briefly. Well, it will take me 10 minutes to go over those remarks. So if you have patience, I can do that.
I think it's okay. We can go.
Okay. So quickly. Schopenhauer conceives of ethics as pertaining to the dimension of one's existence in the world, meaning how we partake in the world as will. Ethics does not belong to the realm of representation that is always conditioned, governed as it is by the principle of sufficient reason. Thus, the concept of law, whether in nature or in the practical sphere, or in our existence with other in a community, belongs to the conditioned. An unconditioned law, such as Kant's so-called categorical imperative, is a contradiction in terms. As Schopenhauer likes to put it, it is wooden iron. The underlying idea that is revealed through the different occasions for conditioned action in the phenomenal world, I use idea now in Schopenhauer's way of thinking of it, is what we call character. Character is the ground of being of which the action and passion of a person are so many reflections. It is necessary, yet can only be revealed and recognized a posteriori, as the knowledge an individual can acquire of the original unity of his actions and passions. It makes no sense to speak of a change in character, since character is precisely the atemporal unity of actions and passions revealed to varying degree over a lifetime. Character expresses itself always and everywhere, but it can express itself, for instance, as the specific ways in which a person fails and suffers through, for instance, setting up plans of actions that are hopeless, given his character. Learning to live in line with one's character would then be through a posteriori knowledge of character to develop habits of action that are most fitting to it. This will be what Schopenhauer calls the acquired character. That is the acquired habit of acting in agreement with the knowledge of one's character. Character in that sense is morally neutral, but one could further think of two fundamental ways of existence open to every character. They can both be said to emerge from the sense that the world is my will. On the one hand, we can conceive of the world as wholly there for my will, that is, for the will of my particular self. This is the perspective of egoism, which can be virulent to different degrees. It is, Schopenhauer says, a natural reversal of the truthful recognition that the world is my will. The latter would mean precisely that I am myself, I am most myself, through the involvement in the world will. And therefore, I do not make such a difference between myself and others, realizing, as it were, that what is most myself manifests itself equally in the rest of the world. This is often characterized as a morality of empathy or compassion. But so as to properly recognize what this compassion comes to, again, we should avoid making it an analogical identification with the suffering of others. Right? If I were in his position, I would feel such and such, and this moves me to act to alleviate the other's suffering. The evil person is one who brought egoism to such an extreme that his highest satisfaction is Schadenfreude, is being happy at the suffering of others. And it is actively sought, as it were, by being cruel towards others. In so doing, from the perspective of world will, that person is hurting themselves. What is inmost in oneself is also the inmost of the world as a whole. Right? The phenomenal manifestation of that truth